Today I'm going to change the transmission fluid and filter on this Humvee, all part of getting this truck purchased from GovPlanet back on the road. We'll see how accurate the maintenance manual is and see if there's any surprises along the way. Because there's dirt stuck in the lines of the trans cooler from the radiator being removed, I'm going to drain the trans. That way I can open up the lines and to be able to get that dirt out. There we go. Ooh. Fluid's nice and red. No water. Looks pretty good. To be able to clean the lines, I'm going to have to take these clamps off. It's funny, for as much as people hate these clamps, they're actually quite easy to use. And here comes the next one. Alright, we're going to get this other one off of here too. So that one looks like I can just push up on it. There we go. To clean out the transmission cooler lines, I kind of built this little device here. It's got a hose that's going to connect to the line, and then it's got the air nozzle. So what I'm going to do is just put this on here. Doesn't have to go on very far. I can connect this. But I can then feed air through the line while brushing it out. The other thing I did is I zip tied a rag in place over the end of the tube to keep from shooting it all over the windshield like I did the first time I tried this. So that's a lot better than having to clean that all up. I got a drip pan underneath that's caught everything because it's just draining down the front's air hook support and dripping down the control arm into the drip pan. And I'll just brush it out like I did before. With the airflow, any dirt is going to come out the top. It's not going to drop down the line. There we go. Now that's out. All right, I've got the floor jack in position underneath the cross member with some load on it so that the cross member doesn't fall. Throw a socket on here and the wrench. All right, and a hammer. Okay. On the A2 trucks, there's this bypass. How it works is it doesn't sense temperature, but it senses pressure. When the fluid is cold, the transmission pressure is high. So there's a big spring in here that gets moved out of the way, and it bypasses fluid from one line to the other instead of sending it through the cooler. As temperature increases, the fluid flows more easily and the pressure drops, so the bypass then closes. Now, the A1 and the M998 trucks, or the 3-speed trucks, don't have this thing. They just run fluid right to the cooler, right back. If the spring were to fail or get stuck in the open position, it would bypass fluid all the time and you get no fluid to the cooler. So some people take these out, some people leave them in. For what it's worth, I'm going to take it out. To do so, basically I'm just going to replace where this T would be. This is on the side that's returning back from, like that. And I'm just going to connect it straight. And it just uses 3/8 transmission cooler line. With the bypass valve removed, I'm going to replace the lines with this rubber hose. And then basically I'll get full fluid flow through the cooler all the time. With things packaged the way they are inside the Humvee, to get the transmission pan out, you actually have to drop the cross member. And then I've got the transfer case supported with a jack stand. Both sides loose, I can lower the cross member down, making sure the transfer case actually catches on the jack stand. And this might take some slight persuasion. Alright, a little bit of hammering and that's out. With the cross member out, you can get to the transmission pan bolts now. They are the classic 10mm. I'm doing my best to not be underneath this thing directly, just because that is not the adventure I want to have. I don't think it would go anywhere. I mean, the motor mounts are holding it in place and everything else. I got 2 jack stands under the transfer case, but that is not how I want to go out. And these ones that hold the bracket for the, I think the shifter, they're 13mm. Something definitely not listed in the tech manual is that the pan won't come down with this bracket in the way. And this bracket can't move because the drive shaft is in the way. So it moves about halfway over where it needs to. So what I'm gonna have to do is drop the drive shaft. So to do that, there's 4 bolts here. The thing that kind of sucks is that the Humvee's not up on jack stands, so I can't turn the drive shaft because it's going to want to turn the wheels. So I just kind of have to go with the orientation that it's in. So with it being a U-bolt, it's actually kind of easy. I know on some of them, it's got the little straps, and it's got 5/16 bolts with 8mm heads, which are about impossible to not round off. Every time I've wound up doing them, I wind up buying the new bolt kit. That way, if I damage the bolts, I got new ones to put it anyway. On this side, there's just enough to get 1 click. With the box end wrench, I managed to get it loose enough so I can move it with my fingers. Because once you get one side loose, it relieves the kind of tension on the other. So it should actually be easier to loosen the other side now. So rather than beating on this thing, I'm going to put a pry bar in here between the nut and the yoke, and I can get the drive shaft to move forward. I don't have to get to move forward much. Oh, I don't want to lose the cap. So I've got the cap stuck now. There's 1 needle bearing coming out. Alright, I got the cap loose. Got at least 3 needle bearings in my hand. And as long as I can get them clean and get them re-greased, it shouldn't be bad. I just got to make sure I have all of them. Now, for what the manual doesn't tell you have to do, but you have to do. All that work to get that bracket down. So now I can take the pan out. We got this far bolt. That's just in finger tight. That's out now. And then the pan probably still has some fluid in it. Yeah, I can feel it. There's at least 1 inch of fluid still in there. So I'm just looking down in there. Yeah, I had previously drained this. Now that this has had a chance to drip for a while, I'm going to take the filter out. So that's done just by kind of wiggling it around and working it free. Alright, that's that. After comparing the old filter to the new one is the same. The new one's just a standard Wix 4L80E filter. So that's fully seated. Gotta clean the pan, get rid of the filter, get rid of this fluid, clean the gasket. Before I put the pan back on, I'm gonna just take a little time and clean off the mating surface as much as possible. Where the gasket seals isn't at the edge of the pan, or isn't at the edge of the transmission. It's probably about 1/4 inch inward. So dirt and everything else can get in there a little bit. So I want to make sure that that's clean. That way if there's any misalignment in the gasket, it won't be trying to seal on dirt from the previous installation. So it should just all fall straight down, which is what's going on here. Down's okay, because down is not in. Down is just down. So with the scraper, I'm going to make sure that I keep it pointed so that I'm not scraping anything into the transmission. Basically, it's just going to be on the outside. Now, I don't want to go too crazy at it and actually like score the machine surface of the case, because that could cause a leak. The next trick is going to be to get the pan back in place without dropping a bunch of dirt in it. And from what it looks like, the pan has to go in an angle to miss the filter. Okay, now I can see the hole. So that's one bolt. Again, it's just to hold it. I've given the pan a thorough cleaning and painted it just to make it not look so scuzzy and gross. So with the anti-seize, I'm just going to apply some to the bolt. I have copper and I've got the aluminum stuff. I'm just going to use the standard aluminum gray stuff and just work my way around the pan. I'm only putting them in finger tight until I get them all in. I don't want any surprises where the gas gets misaligned or something like that and it won't go. The biggest thing anti-seize lets you do is just kind of not destroy the threads, that the steel bolt won't get stuck in the aluminum thread. Actually had that happen on my Super Duty transmission. One of the bolts got stuck, and when I unthreaded it, all I got was just a bunch of aluminum wrapped around the threads. I actually had to helicoil the transmission pan bolt, which was more work. So a 3/8 isn't big enough to get in there with swivel, but a 1/4 inch drive I think is. And the reason I'm using a swivel is that the bolt is actually underneath the exhaust pipe slightly, and without it the bolt will go in at an angle and has a good likelihood of stripping or doing something weird. I got it started, it's straight, so now I'm just slowly getting it in. Then the two long bolts go back where the bracket that works with the shifter goes. So it only goes in one spot, it can't go in any others. And as they say, installation is reverse of assembly. So we're going to torque these all back in. Now with anti-seize on the threads, it actually makes it easier to torque. So you wind up with a situation where the torque value you need isn't as tight as if you were doing it dry. Doing it dry takes more to turn the bolt than when the threads are lubricated with anti-seize. Next to go back on is the drive shaft, just by tightening the U-bolt straps back. It always makes me laugh how tight that they make the U-joint yoke that you can barely get a wrench in there. Now granted, it was designed before these ratcheting wrenches probably ever existed. So the ratcheting wrench doesn't give you as much clearance as a standard box wrench. I already did the upper one, and again I can't rotate the drive shaft because the transmission cross member is still not in. Before I put the cross member and everything else back in place for the transmission, I'm going to refill the pan a bit and check for leaks. It's way easier to do it now than having to take the pan back down and take the cross member back down. According to the service manual, draining the trans and filter change takes 7.7 quarts. I've got two 4-quart jugs, but I'm going to be checking it before I get to 7.7. It'll probably take a little bit more because the cooler lines are now empty. Now, you're supposed to check it with the engine running in park, but just to see where things are. So it's a bit on the full side, mostly because it hasn't circulated back into all the passages and everything else yet. The pan was completely dry when I put it on, so there shouldn't be any residual fluid or anything in that area. In fact, I might just let this sit overnight and see what's going on. The other thing I'm going to do with the crossmember out is replace some of these old fuel lines and vent hoses. They have been under here probably 20 years, and some of them are starting to rot. Well, not rot, but crack and come apart. And I realize I'm snowing dirt on the camera. These are more of those lines where now I got the clamp loose. I'm not going to try to save the line because I'm going to replace it. So I'm just going to go ahead and slit the line so it's easier to remove. I'm actually not sure what this thing is. It's like this weird, the line loops and then goes back on itself. So I don't know if it's part of the vent or what the exact deal is. This 3/8 hose is the main fuel line that goes to the engine. Even if the tank is drained, it's going to still have fuel in it, so have a bucket ready because it's going to leak. So this shows a check valve that was removed from the fuel line between the fuel tank and the fuel pump. So one of the main reasons to remove it, this thing's 20 years old, and there's signs of it splitting and just kind of cracking and being worn out. So on the check valve, just with air, air flows through that way, but not that way. The return line from the injection pump and the injectors has the same check valve in it. This one's 1/4 inch hose, and it's in about the same shape as the supply side. So what I've got is just 1/4 inch fuel hose, and I'm gonna kind of approximate the length that I need up to fit. What's interesting is that on the hose, it says it's AC Delco and it gives the AC Delco part number, but on here it says a Gates part number right there. So it's actually Gates hose made for GM. To install the hose, I actually dipped it in a little diesel to give me a lubrication to get the thing on. Be sure to put the hose clamps on the hose before you slide it on. Otherwise, you got to take the clamp apart and it's a pain in the butt. So, all right, new hose is in place, and I'll adjust the clamp positions to where I want them. Clean it up so I don't get diesel dripped on my face. I smell like diesel already. I guess on the plus side, it means it's not water. I'm looking for where the flare is on the hard line so I can be sure to be on the opposite side. That I need to be on the side of the line, not just crushing the hose down. The other reason I'm doing this now is because you can see the position of the wrench and socket and everything. I'm right where the trans crossmember would be, and it is a lot easier to be doing this with the crossmember out of the way. So I would make a bet that the state of these hoses and everything else is going to be consistent across most surplus Humvees. That their age and just use and they're probably all going to look the same. Replacing the hoses is probably a good idea versus finding out later that you got a big fuel leak. So even though this sounds completely insane, and the fact you took the transmission crossmember and transmission like isolator out as one piece, you have to start the bolts in the isolator before you put the crossmember back in. I tried not doing it, and I omitted that part of the video because I just spent, I don't know, 20 minutes underneath here trying to fit it in, and that was not happening. So I'm going to get them in. I'm not going to tighten them all the way, but just enough to guide the thing into position. And now I'm going to attempt to put the crossmember back in. All bolts on there of the mount through the cross member, or the studs I should say. So I'm going to put nuts on them so it can't go anywhere. With the pry bar, it's possible to get the bolt aligned because the bolt only goes in one spot. With the cross member back in place, the last thing you have to do is torque it back down. Snug and then torque the bolts that hold the transmission mount to the transmission. Then torque the nuts that hold the transmission mount to the cross member. And here's a preview of the next video, getting the injection pump back in along with new injectors and lines. See you then.